Hello, everybody, and welcome to probably not entirely our Modest Guild. Okay, I see the stream running now. Hi. I am Caphriel, also known as Colleen, and I should have found the story in my book before I started the stream, but you know what? Hindsight is 2020. I will be reading you the Shadow Over Innsmouth today, but also I have flipped through this book before, and I know exactly how long this story is, so I am almost positive that I'm not going to be finishing the Shadow Over Innsmouth today, because, Lord, it is a bit of a bit of a read. I've never actually read this story. I just know that everyone keeps telling me to read it, which is funny because my patron is the Great Old One. So, hit him. I'll get real up in this mic. Alright. So a little background, because I have the fancy schmancy Barnes & Noble version of the H.P. Lovecraft tales. Written in November through December 3rd, 1931, this novella, it's a novella. No wonder it's so long. This novella was the result of Lovecraft's attempt to write a story in different manners to see which method worked best. A previous draft is extant in fragments, see appendix. The town of Innsmouth, first cited in Cellophase? There's like 2 dots over the I, and I feel like that's not fair to me to try and pronounce that. Is largely based on the Massachusetts coastal town of Newburyport, although today Newburyport looks very different from the decaying backwater that it was in Lovecraft's day. He had first visited it in 1923 and revisited it in the fall of 1931. Some details of the story appear to be derived from Irvin S. Cobb's Fishhead and Algernon Blackwood, that is a name. Algernon Blackwood's Ancient Sorceries. But its evocation of the insidious decay of an entire community is Lovecraft's own. Rejected twice by Weird Tales, it first appeared as a crudely bound booklet issued by William L. Crawford's Visionary Publishing Company in 1936. My reading voice is extremely different from my talking voice, and Lord, does it make me need water. Alright, so I guess this is chapter 1 of this novella. No, iTunes, I don't want to update. I don't even use you anymore. #Android. During the winter of 1927 through 1928, officials of the federal government made a strange and secret investigation of certain conditions in the ancient Massachusetts seaport of Innsmouth. The public first learned of it in February, when a vast series of raids and arrests occurred, followed by the deliberate burning and dynamiting, under suitable precautions, of an enormous number of crumbling, worm-eaten, and supposedly empty houses along the abandoned waterfront. Uninquiring souls let this occurrence pass as one of the major clashes in a spasmodic war on liquor. Oh yeah, forgot about Prohibition. Keener news followers, however, wondered at the prodigious number of arrests and the abnormally large force of men used in making them, and the secrecy surrounding the disposal of the prisoners. No trials, or even definite charges, were reported, nor were any of the captives seen thereafter in the regular gaols of the nation. There were vague statements about disease and concentration camps, and later about dispersal in various naval and military prisons, but nothing positive ever developed. Innsmouth itself was left almost depopulated, and is even now only beginning to shew signs of a sluggish, revived existence. Complaints from many liberal organizations were met with long confidential discussions, and representatives were taken on trips to certain camps and prisons. As a result, these societies became surprisingly passive and reticent. Newspaper men were harder to manage, but seemed largely to cooperate with the government in the end. Only one paper, a tabloid, always discounted because of its wild policy, mentioned the deep-diving submarine that discharged torpedoes downward in the marine abyss just beyond Devil Reef. That item, gathered by chance in a haunt of sailors, seemed indeed rather far-fetched, since the low Black Reef lies a full mile and a half out from Innsmouth Harbor. People around the country and in the nearby towns muttered a great deal among themselves, but said very little to the outer world. They had talked about dying and half-deserted Innsmouth for nearly a century, and nothing could be wilder and more hideous than what they had whispered and hinted years before. Many things had taught them secretiveness, and there was now no need to exert pressure on them. Besides, they really knew very little, for wide salt marshes, desolate and unpeopled, keep neighbors off from Innsmouth, and the landward side. She sells by seashore. But at last I'm going to defy the ban on speech about this thing. Results, I am certain, are so thorough that no public harm, save a shock of repulsion, could ever accrue from a hinting of what was found by those horrified raiders at Innsmouth. Besides, what was found might possibly have more than one explanation. I do not know just how much the whole tale has been told even to me, and I have many reasons for not wishing to probe deeper, for my contact with this affair has been closer than that of any other layman, and I have carried away impressions that are yet to drive me to drastic measures. It was I who fled frantically out of Innsmouth in the early morning hours of July 16th, 1927, and whose frightened appeals for government inquiry and action brought on the whole reported episode. I was willing to stay mute while the affair was fresh and uncertain, but now that it is an old story, with public interest and curiosity gone, I have an odd craving to whisper about those few frightful hours in that ill-rumored and evilly shadowed seaport of death and blasphemous abnormality. The mere telling helps me to restore confidence in my own faculties, to reassure myself that I was not simply the first to succumb to a contagious nightmare hallucination. It helps me, too, in making up my mind regarding a certain terrible step which lies ahead of me. I never heard of Innsmouth until the day till the day before I saw it for the first time before I saw it for the first and so far last time. There we go. I was celebrating my coming of age by a tour of New England, sightseeing antiquarian and genealogical, and had planned... What the hell does that... Okay. And had planned to go directly from ancient Newburyport to Arkham, whence my mother's family was derived. I had no car, but was traveling by train, trolley, and motor coach, always seeking the cheapest possible route. In Newburyport, they told me that the steam train was the thing to take to Arkham, and it was only at the station ticket office when I demurred at the high fare, that I learned about Innsmouth. The stout, shrewd-faced agent, whose speech shewed him to be no local man, seemed sympathetic towards my efforts at economy, and made a suggestion that none of my other informants had offered. "You could take that old bus, I suppose," he said with a certain hesitation, "but it ain't thought to be much of hereabouts. It goes through Innsmouth. You may have heard about it. And so people don't like it. Run by an Innsmouth fellow, Joe Sargent. But never gets any custom from here, or Arkham either, I guess. Wonder it keeps running at all. I suppose it's cheap enough, but I never see more'n 2 or 3 people in it. Nobody but those Innsmouth folks. Leaves the square front of Hammond's drugstore at 10 a.m. and 7 p.m. unless they changed lately. Looks like a terrible rattletrap. I've never been on it." That was the first I ever heard of Shadowed Innsmouth. Any reference to a town not shewn on common maps or listed in recent guidebooks would have interested me, and the agent's odd manner of allusion roused something like real curiosity. A town able to inspire such dislike in its neighbors, I thought, must be at least rather unusual and worthy of a tourist's attention. If it came before Arkham, I would stop off there, and so I asked the agent to tell me something about it. He was very deliberate, and he spoke with an air of feeling slightly superior to what he said. "Innsmouth? Well, it's a strange sort of town, down at the mouth of the Monet. There's an X in the middle of that word, so I'm just guessing. Where I go? Used to be almost a city. Quite a port before the War of 1812. But all gone to pieces in the last 100 years or so. No railroad now. B&M never went through, and the branch line from Raleigh was given up years ago. More empty houses than there are people, I guess, and no business to speak of except fishing and lobstering. Everybody trades, mostly either here or in Arkham or Ipswich. Once they had a few mills, but nothing's left now except one gold refinery running on the leanest kind of part-time. That refinery, though, used to be a big thing, and old man Marsh, who owns it, must be richer than Croesus. Strange old duck, though, and sticks mighty close in his home. He's supposed to have developed some skin disease or deformity late in life that makes him keep out of sight. Grandson of old Captain Obed Marsh, who founded the business. His mother seems to have been some kind of foreigner. They say a South Sea Islander? So everybody raised Cain when he married an Ipswich girl 50 years ago. They always do that about Innsmouth people, and folks here and hereabouts always try to cover up any Innsmouth blood they have in 'em. But Marsh's children and grandchildren look just like anyone else so far as I can see. I've had 'em pointed out to me here, though come to think of it, the elder children don't seem to be around lately. Never saw the old man. And why is everybody so down on Innsmouth? Well, young fellow, you mustn't take too much stock in what people around here say. They're hard to get started, but once they do get up and started, they never let up. They've been telling things about Innsmouth, whispering 'em mostly for the last 100 years, I guess, but I gather they're more scared than anything else. Some of the stories would make you laugh, about old Captain Marsh driving bargains with the devil and bringing imps out of hell to live in Innsmouth, or about some kind of... Oh, Lord. Devil worship and awful sacrifices in some place near the wharves that people stumbled around 1845 or thereabouts. But I come from Panton, Vermont, and that kind of story don't go down with me. You ought to hear, though, what some of the old-timers tell about the Black Reef off the coast, Devil Reef they call it. It's well above water a good part of the time, never much below it. But at that, you could hardly call it an island. When did I slip into a southern accent? I'm a roll with it. The story is that there's a whole legion of devils seen somewhere on that reef, sprawled out or darting in and out of some kind of caves near at the top. It's a rugged, uneven thing, a good bit over a mile out, and toward the end of shipping days, sailors used to make big detours just to avoid it. That is, sailors that didn't hail from Innsmouth. One of the things they had against old Captain Marsh was that he was supposed to land on it sometimes at night when the tide was just right. Maybe he did, for I dare say the rock formation was interesting. It's just barely possible he was looking for a pirate loot and maybe finding it. But there was talk of his dealing with demons there. Fact is, I guess, on the whole, it was really the captain that gave it the bad reputation to the reef. That was before the... How long is this guy gonna talk for? That was before the big epidemic of 1846. When over half the folks in Innsmouth was carried off. They never did quite figure out what the trouble was, but it was probably some foreign kind of disease brought from China or somewhere by the shipping. It surely was bad enough. There was riots over it, all sorts of ghastly things I don't believe ever got outside of town, and it left the place in awful shape. Never came back. There can't be more than 300 or 400 people living in there now. But the real thing behind the way folks feel is simply race prejudice. It's big coming from you, H.P. Lovecraft. It's big coming from you. And I don't say I'm blaming those that hold it. Of course you're not, H.P. Of course you're not. I hate those Innsmouth folks myself, and I wouldn't care to go into their town. I suppose you know, though I can see that you're a Westerner by your talk, that a lot of our New England ships used to have to do with strange ports in Africa, Asia, and the South Seas, and everywhere else, and what strange kinds of people they sometimes brought back with them. You probably heard about the Salem man that came home with a Chinese wife, and you maybe... I don't like talking about this. Well, it must be something like that back... Okay, apparently something about interracial marriage. I don't know. The place was badly cut off from the rest of the country by marshes and creeks. Something. It's pretty clear that old Cat Marsh must have brought home some odd specimens when he had 3 of his ships in commission back in the 20s and 30s. There certainly is a strange kind of streak in the Innsmouth folks today. I don't know how to explain it, but it sort of makes you crawl. Okay. Some of them have strange narrow heads with flat noses and bulgy, starey eyes that never seem to shut. I'm really hoping that they're not... Are these fish people? And their skin ain't quite right, rough and scabby, and the sides of their necks are all shriveled or creased up. Get bald too, very young. The older fellows look the worst. Fact is, I don't believe I've ever seen a very old chap of that kind. Guess they must die of looking in the glass? Animals hate 'em. They used to have lots of horse trouble before autos came in. Y'all. I'm not gonna lie. I'm getting some real racist vibes from this, and I did not know that that this was so racist. I might switch to Dagon, or because I've read that one and it's significantly less racist. Or I might switch to what's his name? Edgar Allan Poe, because holy shit. I can't believe everyone was like, yeah, this is the best story from him. This is the best story. Like, oh, what the fuck? I'm gonna be right back because that makes me deeply... Also, every time I said strange, it didn't actually say strange. And I'm gonna attribute that to the time period because I know that that word used to mean strange, but like, I don't feel comfortable saying it in that context. So, I'm gonna be right back. I'm gonna go get some sweet, sweet Edgar Allan Poe because, that's good stuff. Hold on, let me edit this to say not the Shadow Over Innsmouth. Because that's gonna be a big ol' yikes from me, dog. HPY. Hold on a second. Why is he so racist?
Yeah, someone in the chat mentioned that.
Yeah, I glanced up and I saw a paragraph, but I read it later and I was like, oh no. That's okay. I was too busy reading to reach So, RIP. I don't know what I expected from a man who named his cat what he named his cat. But my boy Poe is pretty legit. Where the heck is it? I got so racist so fast. I'm not over that. Ah, here it is. So, one of my favorite Poe stories, which I have yet to encounter any racist undertones in, is the Masque of the Red Death. So, I'll change the change the title of this. Hold on a second. There we go. Okay, I think that should be updating. Yeah. Okay. And then, sorry y'all, I had no idea. Well, I mean, I knew about his cat, but I didn't know that story was so bad. Like, the only one I've read from him is Dagon, which was alright. There we go. The Masque of the Red Death. There we go. Okay. This one has cool artwork. Ta-da! So, the Masque of the Red Death. Let's watch me grapple with these fun words, because this one is even older than the other one. My boy Poe speaks super strangely. The last time I read this story, I was super drunk, and I was reading it to my friend who told me that he had not read any Edgar Allan Poe, and I was like, that's unacceptable, and so I started reading this to him, among other things, so it was pretty great, pretty good time. All right. The Red Death had long devastated the country. No pestilence had ever been so fatal or so hideous. Blood was its avatar and its seal, the redness and the horror of blood. There were sharp pains, a sudden dizziness, and then profuse bleeding at the pores, with dissolution, the scarlet stains upon the body, and especially upon the face of the victim, were the pest ban which shut him out from the aid and the sympathy of his fellow men, and the whole seizure, progress and termination of the disease, were the incidents of half an hour. But the Prince Prospero was happy and dauntless and sagacious. When his dominions were half depopulated, he summoned to his presence 1,000 hale and light-hearted friends from among the knights and dames of his court, and with these retired to the deep seclusion of one of his castellated abbeys. This was an extensive and magnificent structure, the creation of the prince's own eccentric yet august taste. A strong and lofty wall girdled it in. This wall had gates of iron. The courtiers, having entered, brought furnaces and massy hammers and welded the bolts. They resolved to leave means neither of ingress or egress to the sudden impulses of despair or of frenzy from within. The abbey was amply provisioned. With such precautions, the courtiers might bid defiance to the contagion. The external world could take care of itself. In the meantime, it was folly to grieve or to think. The prince had provided all the appliances of pleasure. There were buffoons, there were improvisatori, there were ballet dancers, there were musicians, there was beauty, there was wine. All these and security were within. Without was the Red Death. It was toward the close of the 5th or 6th month of his seclusion, and while the pestilence raged most furiously abroad, that the Prince Prospero entertained his 1,000 friends at a masked ball of the most unusual magnificence. It was a voluptuous scene, that masquerade, but first let me tell of the rooms in which it was held. There were 7, an imperial suite. In many palaces, however, such suites form a long and straight vista, while the folding doors slide back nearly to the walls on either hand. so that the view of the whole extent is scarcely impeded. Here the case was very different, as might have been expected from the Duke's love of the bizarre. The apartments were so irregularly disposed that the vision embraced but little more than one at a time. There was a sharp turn at every 20 or 30 yards, and each turn a novel effect. To the right and left, in the middle of each wall, a tall and narrow Gothic window looked out and upon a closed corridor which pursued the windings of the suite. Nailed it. These windows were of stained glass, whose color varied in accordance to the prevailing hue of the decorations of the chamber into which it opened. That at the eastern extremity was hung, for example, in blue, and vividly blue were its windows. The second chamber was purple in its ornaments and tapestries, and here the panes were purple. The third was green throughout, and so were the casements. The fourth was furnished and lighted with orange. The fifth was white. The sixth with violet. The seventh apartment was closely shrouded in black velvet tapestries that hung all over the ceiling and down the walls, falling in heavy folds upon a carpet of the same material and hue. But in this chamber only, the color of the windows failed to correspond with the decorations. The panes here were scarlet, a deep blood color. Now, in no one of the 7 apartments was there any lamp or candelabrum, amid the profusion of golden ornaments that lay scattered to and fro, or depended from the roof. There was no light of any kind emanating from a lamp or candle within the suite of chambers. But in the corridors that followed the suite there stood, opposite to each window, a heavy tripod, bearing a brazier of fire that protected its rays through the tinted glass and so glaringly illumined. It's a good word. The room, and thus were produced a multitude of gaudy and fantastic appearances. But in the western or black chamber, the effect of the firelight that streamed upon the dark hangings through the blood-tinted panes was ghastly in the extreme, and produced so wild a look upon the countenances of those who entered, that there were few of the company bold enough to set foot in its precincts at all. It was in this apartment also that there stood against the western wall a gigantic clock of ebony. Its pendulum swung to and fro with a dull, heavy, monotonous clang, and when the minute hand made the circuit of the face, and the hour was to be stricken, there came from the brazen lungs of the clock a sound which was clear and loud and deep and exceedingly musical, but of so peculiar a note and emphasis that at each lapse of an hour the musicians of the orchestra were constrained to pause momentarily in their performance to hearken the sound, and thus the waltzers' performance ceased their evolutions, and there was a brief disconcert of the whole gay company, and while the chimes of the clock yet rang, it was observed that the giddiest grew pale, and the more aged and sedate passed their hands over their brows as if in confused reverie or meditation. That was all one sentence. I need water. Lord. But when the echoes had fully ceased, a light laughter at once pervaded the assembly. The musicians looked at each other and smiled as if their own nervousness and folly and made whispering vows, each at each other, that at the next chiming of the clock should produce in them no similar emotion, and then, after the lapse of 60 minutes, which embraced 3,600 seconds of that the time that flies, there came another chiming of the clock, and then there were the same disconcert and tremulousness and meditation as before. But in spite of these things, it was gay and magnificent and revel. The tastes of the Duke were peculiar. He had a fine eye for colors and effects. He disregarded the decora of mere fashion. His plans were bold and fiery, and his conceptions glowed with barbaric luster. There are some who would have thought him mad. His followers felt that he was not. It was necessary to hear and see and touch him to be sure that he was not. He had directed, in great part, the movable embellishments of the 7 chambers upon occasion of this great fete. I don't know how to pronounce that. It looks like feet, but like there's a little caret above the first E. Weird. And it was his own guiding taste that had given character to the masqueraders. Be sure they were grotesque. There were much glare and glitter and piquancy and phantasm, much of what has been since seen in Hernani. There were arabesque figures with unsuited limbs and appointments. There were delirious fancies, such as the madman fashions. There was much of the beautiful, much of the wanton, much of the bizarre, something of the terrible, and not a little of that which might have excited disgust. To and fro in the 7 chambers there stalked, in fact, a multitude of dreams, and these, the dreams, writhed in and about, taking hue from the rooms, and causing the wild music of the orchestra to seem as the echo of their steps. And anon there strikes the ebony clock which stands in the hall of the velvet, and there for a moment all is still, and all is silent save the voice of the clock, and the dreams are stiff frozen as they stand. But the echoes of the chime die away, and have endured but an instant, and a light, half-subdued laughter floats after them as they depart. And now again the music swells, and the dreams live, and writhe to and fro more merrily than ever, taking hue from the many-tinted windows, through which stream the rays of the tripods. But to the chamber which lies most westwardly of the 7, there are now none of the maskers who venture, for the night is waning away, and there flows a ruddier light through the blood-colored panes, and the blackness of the sable drapery appalls. And to him whose foot falls upon the sable carpet, there comes from the near clock of ebony a muffled peal more solemnly emphatic than any which reaches their ears who indulge in the more remote gaieties of the other apartments. Water. But these other apartments were densely crowded, and in them beat feverishly the heart of life. And the revel went whirlingly on, until at length there commenced the sound of midnight upon the clock. And when the music ceased, as I have told, and the evolutions of the waltzers were quieted, and there was an uneasy cessation of all things as before. But now there were 12 strokes to be sounded by the bell of the clock, and thus it happened, perhaps, that more of thought crept with more of time into the meditations of the thoughtful among those who revelled, and thus too it happened, perhaps, that before the last echoes of the last chime had utterly sunk into silence, there were many individuals in the crowd who had found leisure to become aware of the presence of a masked figure, which had arrested the attention of no single individual before. And the rumor of this new presence having spread itself whisperingly around, there arose at length from the whole company a buzz or murmur expressive of disapprobation and surprise, then, finally, of terror, of horror, and of disgust. In an assembly of phantasms such as I have painted, it may well be that no ordinary appearance could have excited such sensation. In truth, the masquerade license of the night was nearly unlimited, but the figure in question had out-Heroded Herod, and gone beyond the bounds of even the prince's infinite decorum. There are chords in the hearts of the most reckless which cannot be touched without emotion, even with the utterly lost, to whom life and death are equally jests. There are matters of which no jest can be made. The whole company, indeed, seemed now deeply to feel in the costume and bearing of the stranger neither wit nor propriety existed. The figure was tall and gaunt, and shrouded from head to foot in the habiliments of the grave. The mask which concealed the visage was made so nearly to resemble the countenance of a stiffened corpse that the closest scrutiny must have had difficulty in detecting the cheat, and yet all this might have been endured, if not approved, by the mad revelers around. But the mummer had gone so far as to assume the type of the Red Death. His vestige was dabbled in blood, and his broad brow, with all the features of the face, was sprinkled with the scarlet horror. When the eyes of Prince Prospero fell upon this spectral image, which, with a slow and solemn movement, as if more fully to sustain its role, stalked to and fro among the waltzers, he was seen to be convulsed, in the first moment, with a strong shudder either of terror or distaste, but in the next his brow reddened with rage. "Who dares?" he demanded, hoarsely, of the courtiers who stood near him. "Who dares insult us with this blasphemous mockery? Seize him and unmask him, that we may know whom we have to hang at sunrise from the battlements." It was in the eastern or blue chamber in which stood the Prince Prospero as he uttered these words. They rang throughout the 7 rooms loudly and clearly, for the prince was a bold and robust man, and the music had become hushed at the waving of his hand. It was in the blue room where stood the prince, with a group of pale courtiers by his side. At first, as he spoke, there was a slight rushing movement of the group in the direction of the intruder, who at the moment was also near at hand, and now with deliberate and stately step made closer approach to the speaker. But from a certain nameless awe with which the mad assumptions of the mummer had inspired the whole party, there were found none who put forth hand to seize him, so that unimpeded my voice, he passed within a yard of the prince's person, and while the vast assembly, as if with one impulse, shrank from the centers of the rooms as to the walls, he made his way uninterrupted, but with the same solemn and measured step which had distinguished him from the first, through the blue chamber to the purple, through the purple to the green, through the green to the orange, through this again to the white, and even thence to the violet, ere a decided movement had been made to arrest him. It was then, however, that Prince Prospero, maddening with rage and the shame of his own momentary cowardice, rushed hurriedly through the 6 chambers, while none followed him on account of a deadly terror that had seized upon all. He bore aloft a drawn dagger, and had approached in rapid impetuosity Impetuosity. Of all the words I can't pronounce. Yeah, I don't know. Impetuosity, I'm gonna say it. I'm gonna do it that way. To within 3 or 4 feet of the retreating figure, when the latter, having attained the extremity of the velvet apartment, turned suddenly and confronted his pursuer. There was a sharp cry, and the dagger dropped, gleaming upon the sable carpet, upon which, instantly afterwards, fell prostrate in death the Prince Prospero. Then, summoning the wild courage of despair, a throng of the revelers at once threw themselves into the black apartment, and seizing the mummer, whose tall figure stood erect and motionless within the shadow of the ebony clock, gasped in unutterable horror at the finding of the grave cerements and corpse-like mask, which they handled with so violent a rudeness untenanted by any tangible form. And now was acknowledged the presence of the Red Death. He had come like a thief in the night, and one by one dropped the revelers in the blood-dewed halls of their revel, and died each in the despairing posture of his fall. And the life of the ebony clock went out with that of the last of the merry, and the flames of the tripods expired, and darkness and decay and the Red Death held illimitable dominion over all. Bum, bum, bum. More cool artwork. Neat. There we go. Yeah, it's very fancy. Do, 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 do. Yeah. So that one is much cooler than the other one. Hi, Shannon. Yes. So, sorry that HP Lovecraft didn't work out. Hey, yeah. I was planning on reading for longer, but since, yeah. Oh, hey. Coughing Seagull has joined us. I'll do one more. I'll find the Raven. Whoops. Hey. I forgot that that's the chat window. Hey. Alright. Alright, I have to do it here. Okay. Dobby. Oh, he's giving me a face. He giving me them eyes. You see those little eyes he giving me? Yeah. He cute boy. I'll make sure I get out of the way while I read so that you guys can see Toby. Alright. So, here is The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. Not H.P. Lovecraft. Fuck that guy. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary, over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, "tapping at my chamber door. Only this and nothing more." Ah, distinctly I remember, it was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. Eagerly I wished the morrow, vainly I had sought to borrow from my books surcease of sorrow, sorrow for the lost Lenore, for the rare and radiant maiden whom the angels name Lenore, nameless here for evermore. And the silken, sad, uncertain rustling of each purple curtain thrilled me, filled me with fantastic terrors never felt before, so that now, to this beating of my heart, I stood repeating, "'Tis some visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door. 'Tis some late visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door. This it is and nothing more." Presently my soul grew stronger, hesitating then no longer. "Sir," I said, "or madam, truly your forgiveness I implore. But the fact is I was napping, and so gently you came rapping, and so faintly you came tapping, tapping at my chamber door, that I scarce was sure I heard you. Here I opened wide the door, darkness there and nothing more. Deep into that darkness peering, long I stood there wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming, dreams no mortal ever dared to dream before. But the silence was unbroken, and the stillness gave no token, and the only word there spoken was the whispered word Lenore. This I whispered, and an echo murmured back the word Lenore. Merely this and nothing more. Open here I flung the shutter, when, with many a flirt and flutter, in there stepped a stately raven of the saintly days of yore. Not the least obeisance made he, not a minute stopped or stayed he, but with mine of lord or lady perched above my chamber door, perched upon a bust of Pallas just above my chamber door, perched and sat, nothing more. Then this ebony bird beguiling my sad fancy into smiling, by the grave and stern decorum of the countenance it wore. Through thy crest be shorn and shaven, thou, I said, art sure no craven, ghastly grim and ancient raven wandering from the nightly shore. Tell me what thy lordly name is on the night's Plutonian shore, quoth the raven. It's so hard. You guys are here for Toby, I know it. Here we go. Where's chat? Much I marveled this ungainly fowl to hear discourse so plainly. Through its answer little meaning, little relevancy bore. For we cannot help agreeing that no living human being, bird or beast, upon the sculpted bust above his chamber door with such a name as Nevermore. But the raven sitting lonely on the placid bust spoke only of one word, as if his soul in that one word he did outpour. Nothing farther than he uttered, not a feather. Then he fluttered, till I scarcely more than muttered, other friends have flown before. On the morrow he will leave me, as my hopes have flown before. Then the bird said nevermore. What's great is that, like, this is about a guy's descent into madness, and you can tell that I'm just, like, descending into madness trying to read this out loud. I did a good job on the other one. I should have quit while I was ahead. Startled at the stillness broken by reply so aptly spoken, doubtless, said I, what it utters is its only stock and store, caught from some unhappy master, whose unmerciful disaster followed fast and followed faster, till his songs one burden bore, till the dirges of his hope and that melancholy burden bore of never, never more. But the raven still beguiling all my fancy into smiling, straight I wheeled a cushioned seat in front of the bird and bustin' door. Then upon the velvet sinking, I betook myself to linking fancy unto fancy, thinking what this ominous bird of yore, what this grim, ungainly, ghastly, gaunt, and ominous bird of yore meant in croaking nevermore. This I sat engaged in guessing, but no syllable expressing to the fowl whose fiery eyes now burned into my bosom's core. This and more I sat divining, with my head at ease reclining on the cushion's velvet lining, that the lamp light gloated o'er, but whose velvet violet lining with the lamp light gloating o'er she shall press, ah, nevermore. Then methought the air grew denser, perfumed from an unseen censer, swung by seraphim whose footfalls tinkled on the tufted floor. Wretch, I cried, thy God hath lent thee, by these angels he hath sent thee respite, respite, nepenthe from thy memories of Lenore. Quaff, oh quaff, this kind of nepenthe, and forget this lost Lenore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophet still, if bird or devil, whether tempter or whether tempest tossed thee here ashore, desolate yet all undaunted, on this desert land enchanted, on this home by horror haunted. Tell me truly, I implore, is there balm in Gilead? Tell me, I implore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophet still, if bird or devil, by that heaven that bends us, by that heaven that bends above us, by that God we both adore, tell this soul with sorrow laden, if within the distant Aidenn it shall clasp a sainted maiden, whom the angels name Lenore, clasp a rare and radiant maiden, whom the angels name Lenore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Be that word our sign of parting, bird or fiend, I shrieked upstarting, get thee back into the tempest and the night's Plutonian shore. Leave no black perfume as token of that lie thy soul hath spoken. Leave my loneliness unbroken, quit the bust above my door. Take thy beak out of my heart, and take thy form from off my door. Quoth the raven, nevermore. And the raven, never flitting, still is sitting on the pallid bust of Pallas just above my chamber door, and his eyes of all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming, and the lamplight o'er him streaming through the shadows on the floor, and my soul from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted nevermore. I do tell we, he's unimpressed. Thank you, Taylor. For some reason, reading it faster helps. All right. With that, I'm gonna end it here. I want to do more reading things. I thought that the Shadow Over Innsmouth was gonna last me like at least a couple of weeks. And now that I know that I'm definitely not gonna read that story, I'm not sure what I'm gonna do next week. I'll figure something out. Maybe Will can craft next week or something, like Grandpa. Or, I don't know. It would be cool, since Tara's here, to set up like a Mihi's library thing and set up like a popcorn reading thing with Mihi. That'd be fun. Don't hold me to it just because it's suggested on stream, in case she doesn't want to do it. But yeah, that'd be neat. Because then we wouldn't be stuck to specifically HP. I had to pivot quickly. My plan went to crap. Oh, yeah, that's true. We'll figure something out. But yeah, that'll be cool. Thanks, guys, who came. It was fun. And, bye.